Welcome to episode 4, everyone. Last session, I suggested that if we want to make sense of the relationship between science and politics, politics needs to be understood as a more expansive term. A political project involves many different processes by which we try to enact the kind of world that we want. Politics, as conventionally understood, the overt mechanisms of government and policy, is just one of the small facets of such a project. And understood in this broader sense, science is quite clearly part of the project of creating the world that we want to live in. Indeed, it is arguably in this regard that science derives most of its authority in helping us to produce technologies that build our envisioned world. As Jasanoff and Simmet reiterate, these projects are always defined by our values. Sometimes these values can be made quite explicit, as when philosophers like Brown or Kitcher argue that democracy and science are mutually dependent. But often the values at play are more implicit. Jasanoff and Simmet point to 4 general ways that knowledge-making, including science, is linked to values. The first way can be characterized as an immediate form of the notion that values guide fact-finding. We always seek out knowledge that we think will directly be useful to the concerns at hand. Often these concerns are exigencies. Maybe there's a hurricane approaching, and we want knowledge that will help us save lives or prevent damage. The second way is a systems form of values guide fact-finding. We operate within a system of values. So what we deem to be useful is not fully contingent and certainly not arbitrary, but determined by historical trajectories which establish many background values that we take for granted. The hurricane becomes a greater concern if we happen to have built a city that lies in its path. The third way that science is linked to values is that scientific knowledge claims carry authority, and authority is always political. Of course, many try to argue that science's authority is justified, but what counts as justified authority is one of the central, if not the central question of politics. Finally, science and values are inextricably linked because setting the conditions for what we deem to be good inquiries is always a political project. It involves setting norms, creating institutions, systems of accountability and enforcement, and so on. But as we also discussed last session, the notion that science is value-laden runs up against long-standing conceptions of science as value-free, a corollary of the vision of apolitical science. Jasanoff and Simmet point to the traditional is-ought distinction that is at play here. There is a common notion that science is about the way the world is, whereas politics is about deciding how we think the world ought to be. This distinction is easy enough to understand. We understand distinctions between non-fiction and fiction, fact and fantasy, reality and imagination. One aspect of science that apparently demonstrates the distinction between is and ought is science's capacity to produce abstract knowledge. Science is value-free because we can abstract our understanding of the way the world is from the context and values that shape those inquiries in the first place. And quite clearly, we can in various ways. Knowledge is transferable. We can apply it to cases different than those in which that knowledge emerged. But this does not mean that we have severed that knowledge from values. The ability to abstract knowledge, creating understandings of the world that can be applied in many contexts and to many problems, is precisely why we value that knowledge in the first place. Just as we value multifunctionality in technologies, like our smartphones, knowledge that can be abstracted increases its instrumental worth. But even if we try to move beyond instrumental knowledge, this just takes us deeper into values, not further away. There is no arbitrary pursuit of the is. The notion of pure science, that we should pursue an understanding of the way the world is out of sheer curiosity, is perhaps the pinnacle of value-laden science. What is more valuable than purity? talk of pure science is to lay out a kind of virtue ethics, that getting a good picture of the world, however we define that, is a virtue in and of itself. But there is no objective, self-evidently rational fact in the universe that dictates that we should pursue truth in the particular ways and to the limits and standards that we do. This involves a value judgment. Personally, I've always found arguments that we can fully detach is from ought self-defeating, especially since such an argument is invariably offered in defense of the value of science. The extreme would be to say that science can provide truths that do not matter to anyone at any time for any particular reason. This would mean separating knowledge from any potential knower. What kinds of truths would these be if not entirely trivial and irrelevant? You tell me, it's raining outside. There's an objective fact, detached from values, right? But why are you telling me this? Should I wear a raincoat? Bring an umbrella? No, I just thought you would like to know that it's raining. Okay, thanks. Is versus ought is a useful and substantive distinction, just as fact and fiction is. But they are not separable. They are a conjugate pair. We make no pursuits of understanding the way the world is independently of our visions of the way we want the world to be. We try to understand the world so we can inform our behaviors, see what our limits are, see what the possibilities are to technologically change that world. When you look at scientific controversies, say over the risks of some medication, concerns that certain claims makers are distorting the truth to fulfill their own interests, say for pharmaceutical profit, these claims don't emerge out of an abstract commitment to truth. They are also grounded in interests. People want to know what the actual risks are. And this is connected to their vision of the way they want the world to be. A vision about how health should be valued, risks should be managed, and the responsibilities of corporations, governments, and the public should be enacted. Jasanoff and Simmet argue that the inseparability of is and ought, fact and value, science and politics, and the failure to recognize this inseparability is a defining feature of our post-truth world. While ostensibly we are debating about the way the world is, what we are really seeing is conflicts about what particular understandings of the world matter, and thus conflicts of value. Specifically, Jasanoff and Simmet point to competing conceptions of democracy. This is part of it, but the larger issue is that claims to truth are always a matter of judgment and interpretation, and one's own interpretive apparatus depends on a vast constellation of assumptions. Some of these might be about democracy, but there are many battles of assumptions and battles of value going on in our post-truth environment. Jasanoff and Simmet's crucial point is that science and politics are co-produced. Science not only reflects values, but science informs values. All scientific knowledge has political consequences. To discover a fact about the world is to change the world, because it creates new possibilities. The closer those possibilities align with our visions of the world, the quicker and more overtly that matter of fact becomes a matter of concern. But why has the inseparability of fact and value and science and politics now become manifest? It's not simply because our traditional political values have changed such that politics, those of the liberal elite, for example, could no longer hide behind a veneer of scientific rationality. And as I've suggested previously, the problems that we are trying to get a grasp on, these wicked problems like climate change or COVID-19, or social problems like systemic racism, are so complex that it's perhaps impossible to parse out all of the assumptions at play, and thus difficult to pinpoint precisely where conflicts in judgment arise. As was noted in our online discussions, perhaps the world has not changed. It has always been complex. Instead, what's changed is the way we access this complexity. In this regard, as Jasanoff and Simmet note, the apparatus of science have changed. The seeds of the current conflict arise in the 1970s with the expanding role of regulatory and scientific bodies, like the EPA, for instance. But it wasn't merely that their mandates changed to include a greater range of concerns, but that the kinds of knowledge that they generated were not possible before this. New statistical and probability-based models, powered by increasing computing power, which facilitated not only the processing, but also the collection of data, allowed experts to produce knowledge that wasn't possible 50 years prior. The discovery of global warming, as historian Spencer Weir notes, went hand in hand with the technological apparatuses that allowed us to detect, measure, and model the phenomenon. So, in this regard, the world actually has changed, and we are the ones who have changed it. We have expanded our capacity to make changes in the world on larger and larger scales, ironically, through the power of scientific truth. Climate change emerges as a consequence of our vast technoscience. Not incidentally, we find here another connection with diagnoses of postmodernity, the rise of risk as a defining feature of our society, or techno-society. And risk goes hand in hand with uncertainty. As Jasanoff and Simmet note, uncertainty is one of the defining features of our post-truth age. The paradox here is that an ever more powerful and expansive technoscience is what leads to the erosion of certainty, not because we had ever attained certainty, but because we were unable to grasp uncertainty. The continued post-truth insistence on returning to the refuge of facts can thus be interpreted in a few ways. To start, it is important to acknowledge that something like the vulgar sense of post-truth actually exists. Bad faith, disingenuous, if not unscrupulous, claims that try to appropriate some of the authority of science in particular, and conceptions of truth and objectivity in general. Often these are naked attempts to mislead people. There is no shortage of these kinds of tactics in climate change discourses, for example. That was a big hill. And there are battles over truth that might be less intentionally disingenuous, but nonetheless try to recruit some of the moral absolve that facts bring. Why be forced to confront your values and thus acknowledge their debatability when you can simply insist on facts? In climate change debates, there is a class of skeptic that concedes the consensus scientific account is accurate. Global mean temperatures are rising, and humans are primarily to blame. They might even concede that we could do something about it. They just don't care to. Their values are placed firmly in the short term. They are unwilling to sacrifice that vision of the world in terms of giving up luxuries or prospective wealth accumulation in the name of some future that is uncertain. The precautionary principle is not a value they adopt. This is a particularly kind of forthright climate skeptic, or perhaps climate apathetic, who is willing to come clean about their values. But, of course, such a position invites all sorts of moral criticism. So it is a better tactic to outright reject that the world is a certain way or contains certain kinds of possibilities than to admit that you don't care that it is that way or refuse to confront the moral implications of those possibilities. Here, the very claim to scientific purity becomes overtly political. It sets up an impossible standard. If your values do not lead to the adoption of a precautionary approach, insisting on purity or certainty is an effective way to bypass that concern. Again, this is not to say that this is a deliberate maneuver or even a conscious refusal to confront one's values. As Jasanoff and Simmet suggest, there is a deeply entrenched blind spot about the ways that our values shape our truth-seeking. And this is a product of long-standing ways of going about making and employing facts. Here I think Blackburn's reminder of C.S. Peirce's observation that one's willingness to accept claims to truth is proportional to one's capacity to live with the discomfort of uncertainty more deeply characterizes our post-truth predicament. In my view, that discomfort drives the pursuit of truth and claims to truth more strongly than notions of epistemological virtue. And this, incidentally, undermines the classic distinction between fact and emotion. We pursue facts because it is emotionally satisfying. Post-truth is less about Machiavellian strategies to appropriate notions of objectivity, and more about an emotional, if not subconscious, inclination to avoid the discomfort of uncertainty. People are confronting uncertainty on multiple levels. Visions of the world that once gave comfort are seeming less plausible. The overt politics that we are witnessing, and which Jasanoff and Simmet describe specifically in the American context, is a reaction to many kinds of uncertainty. I argued previously that, contrary to the postmodern diagnosis, meta-narratives remain intact. That's what makes them meta. Their capacity to elevate one's specific vision of the world to a place of greater meaning. I would, however, concede that meta-narratives no longer function as they once did. It's plausible in light of the increasing political fracturing that conceptions of democracy, another prominent modernist meta-narrative, were once more effective at holding imagined communities together. But this was not because the diverse communities that made up a nation like the United States actually operated with a shared and coherent conception of democracy, but rather that the local community did not have to confront the paradoxes of those conceptions. After all, this is a nation in which the concept of separate but equal made sense to large swaths of the population as an accommodation of that country's foundational declaration that all men are created equal. Jasanoff and Simmet point to a factor cited by Blackburn and others in the emergence of post-truth, new forms of media. There was once a utopian vision that the internet would be unifying, but this assumed that everyone would venture out into the World Wide Web and find others operating with the same versions of various meta-narratives. But instead, what is being increasingly exposed is all the piecemeal ways that people have gone about envisioning and inquiring about the world. As Jasanoff and Simmet ask, quote, "But in a republic that is more diverse in its experiences and aspirations than it might appear from the liberal enclaves of Vermont or California, what do hot days or declining sea ice actually mean for how lower income people would like to live in Michigan or Mississippi? Whose task is it to bring those implications into view in ways that allow people to feel some control over their and their children's lives." End quote. Making facts, scientific or otherwise, has always been about making those facts matter, to give them meaning. And like Peirce, Jasanoff and Simmett point to a very basic psychological need of people that underlies the meaning they give their lives. A feeling of control, some certainty about the world. Without that feeling of control, then one's pursuits seem arbitrary and relapse into existentialism. Because facts and values are co-produced, when there is uncertainty about one, there is uncertainty about the other. And it is perhaps uncertainty about one's values that is even more unsettling. This is why the science wars 25 years ago needed to be understood in the broader context of the culture wars, which themselves emerged in response to the broader trends of postmodernity. How people understood science was a part of their broader worldviews and systems of values. These were tied to conceptions of progress, and in the American context, exceptionalism that gave people's lives meaning and indeed an identity. Today, the resurgence of a crisis of truth is again tied to an identity crisis revolving around notions of American exceptionalism, a longing for an earlier time where things appeared more certain and more ordered. What Jasanoff and Simmett point out is that it is those who are making distressed claims that we have entered a post-truth world, namely those in the liberal tradition, as well as the alleged perpetrators, the emergent populist right, that are both looking backwards. I often think about the phenomenon of climate change denial in this context. It's clearly a rhetorically loaded term, but I think despite this, it is quite appropriate in pointing to a key characteristic of our post-truth moment. Climate change denial is often held up as an example of the complete disregard for truth. But as I discussed previously, climate change deniers are not rejecting the concept of truth outright. In fact, many of them are positivists. What makes them deniers is the psychological connotation of that term. Denial is a common psychological response to an emotionally and morally fraught problem, especially one that takes on a personal dimension. Certainly, part of the resistance to confronting climate change is because it demands a personal confrontation with one's lifestyle and thus identity. But I think the problem goes deeper than this. Climate change undermines appeals of scientific certainty. It is a problem both in terms of is and ought that cannot be adequately addressed with traditional conceptions of truth. And that confrontation is unsettling. As a way forward, what Jasanoff and Simmett call for is, firstly, a recognition of the inextricable connection between facts and values. This, they hope, will shift the focus of discussion to a more open exchange of one's values, so that the core conflicts come into view rather than hiding behind a veneer of facts. While they don't say it explicitly, what they're talking about here is reflexivity. They call for reflection upon one's assumptions, to think about what one holds to be self-evident. But as I said, I think the conflicts that characterize the post-truth moment are precisely a result of that confrontation with one's deep-seated values, if only implicitly. Certainly, we could make this clearer and more conscientious, but what we need is a way of reflecting on those values and assumptions that is imbued with humility. It is not simply a matter of identifying the value conflicts at play, but of demanding that proponents open up those values for discussion and debate. What Jasanoff and Simmet seem to be asking for, at least in the American context, is a genuinely open-minded constitutional debate. They want to establish nonpartisan, stable, and clearly defined criteria for enacting public facts. This is quite a tall order. America already has a strongly constitutionally oriented politics. But in that hyperpolarized, or maybe multiply fractured political environment, appeals to the Constitution, literally or figuratively, are already hyperpartisan. It's also possible that the very notion of a constitution is too modern to satisfactorily cope with our uncertain world. Constitutions have always run the risk of becoming malleable meta-narratives. This has always been the challenge of building the vast kinds of community represented by the nation-state. They have been grounded in myths, rather than tangible political projects defined by communities with shared experiences, problems, and concerns. Or perhaps Jasanoff and Simmet are proposing something more reflexive and malleable than a constitution, a doubly tall order, asking people to rethink long-standing conceptions of scientific truth is demanding enough, but asking them to fundamentally rethink their entire political orders might be an impossible request. And as we discussed last week, the same demands were presented a quarter of a century ago. Bruno Latour's "We Have Never Been Modern" presented precisely this problem, the need to abandon the modern constitution in both the inextricably linked epistemological and political senses. We don't seem any closer to letting go. The very diagnosis that there is a fundamental fault with the way that we construct our understandings and visions of the world does not seem to be widely entertained. Indeed, this is something that needs to be entered into both epistemological and political debates. It needs to become an active discourse in the sphere of public reason. This returns us to a problem posed previously by Turner, the notion that a successful marriage of science and democracy requires what Philip Kitcher calls a, quote, tutored public. In Jasanoff and Simmet's discussion, there are echoes of concerns about deficit models. They talk about the disenfranchisement and disillusionment of the public created by elitist fact-making that judgmentally dismisses public concerns in the names of objectivity. Now, simply put, the deficit model is the notion that public ignorance is a major obstacle in addressing some techno-scientific concern. In the case of climate change, for example, the idea is that if we educated the public better about radiative forcing of different greenhouse gases or global mean temperature records, they would accept climate change as a serious matter of concern. But expanding the scope of public deliberation to include values instead of narrowly delineated technical facts does not remove concerns about deficits. Rather, it expands the kinds of knowledges that one needs to include. And of course, as STS scholars, Jasanoff and Simmet are making their own claims about the way the world is. They are saying that decision makers are operating with a faulty conception of how technoscience operates. And incidentally, it is STS that shows us how technoscience actually works. But they practice what they preach. They do not hide their values or their political project, and they try to make the case for why their picture of the way the world is matters. This echoes Collins in certain regards, who argues that it is precisely STS's potential to give accurate accounts of science and technology that gives it its capacity to inform political deliberation. But at least two fundamental problems remain. First, there seems to be no escaping the problem of deficits. While simplistic deficit models framed around lay publics and scientific literacy do break down quickly, the deficit metaphor points to a basic assumption of any knowledge making, that certain kinds of knowledge are necessary for addressing some matter of concern. Showing that facts and values are inextricably linked just amplifies this. We don't produce knowledge arbitrarily, but based on the needs of the task at hand. This is indeed Jasanoff and Simmet's point. The central decision makers about technoscientific issues are deficient in certain kinds of perspectives and understandings. The second problem: why should the public be any more inclined to accept our expert knowledge claims than those of climate scientists or public health experts? There is a risk of conceit here, and even a suggestion that the public intuitively operates with a conception of science that is reflexive about failures of traditional conceptions of truth. That the public themselves are calling for greater democratization of science. In other words, STS often imagines that the public is on our side. I'm not sure the evidence fully supports this. Jasanoff and Simmet frame post-truth as a problem of elites who are out of touch with public concerns. But they run the risk of reinforcing public versus expert, layperson versus elite divides. But technoscientific controversies are not battles between experts and the public, but between various groups of allies. And these groups consist of diverse stakeholders, experts of various kinds, politicians, corporations, and members of the public in various capacities, as workers or parents or homeowners, and so on. And each of these stakeholders might operate with the conceptions of science that STS finds problematic. This reveals what is really wrong with the deficit model. There's no such thing as the public. There are instead many public coalitions. Here I think we can expand a bit on the question with which we ended last time and developed in the following discussions. I asked, what do we need to learn in order to enter public deliberations? Presumably, one of the things we need to think about is how to navigate or align ourselves with public coalitions. If we want to play a nonpartisan role or help establish what Jasanoff and Simmet call for, shared imaginations, how might we overcome polarization? Reflecting on our own values, what conflicts might these present? If post-truth is a failure of making facts matter, how do we make our knowledge matter?